I think it's notable that we're talking not only about what went wrong, but this autopsy report, which again is on the web at democraticautopsy.org, calls for some very specific steps that need to be taken by the Democratic National Committee and National Democratic Party leadership as a whole. And I'd like to run through some specific recommendations included in the report. One is that in keeping with the findings in this report, which frankly I found very shocking in working on it, that the Democratic National Committee, despite all of the horrific voter suppression laws in many states, has devoted minimal resources to fighting against these abrogations and abridgments of people's power. And so as late as May of this year, there was a grand total of one full-time staff person at the Democratic National Committee to challenge voter suppression. It's just really stunning. And then they announced in May of this year that they were going to gear up to a grand total of 4 after a grand total of 1. Well, this is a big country, and I hate to think of the amount of money spent on food and drink by the DNC in ratio to the money that was spent for that one full-time staff person in the midst of the horrific assault on voting rights throughout the election year last year. As the saying goes, past is prologue, and here we are. And so the report, Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis, specifically calls for, and I'll quote here, the Democratic National Committee must make up for lost time by accelerating its very recent gear-up of staffing to fight against the multi-front assaults on voting rights that include voter ID laws, purges of voting rolls, and intimidation tactics, unquote. We have heard and seen a lot of news lately, revelations that are not new, but there's more specifics coming out about how the Democratic National Committee functioned in an undemocratic way throughout the primary and caucus season for the 2016 presidential nomination process. And quoting here from the autopsy that has been issued independently this week, the Democratic National Committee should commit itself to scrupulously adhering to its charter, which requires the DNC to be even-handed in the presidential nominating process. Related to the issue of democracy is, of course, that of the superdelegates, which got a lot of discussion in the press last year. The path forward to have a democratizing process in the Democratic Party is to end the voting power of all superdelegates. And our autopsy report specifically points out that, in our words, the voting power of all superdelegates to the Democratic National Convention must end. And that's because the superdelegate system, by its very nature, undermines the vital precept of one person, one vote. We're also elaborating in the autopsy report about the role of social movements, that social movements must not be seen and cannot be accurately understood as a tool to get candidates elected, that social movements are not a subset of election campaigns for social change. It's rather the opposite, that if there's a healthy relationship between election campaigns and social movements, then those campaigns are subsets and a part of the broader efforts to achieve genuine progressive social change. And to quote our autopsy report, this is about more than just increasing voter turnout. It is about energizing as well as expanding the base of the party. To do this, we must aggressively pursue 2 tracks: fighting right-wing efforts to rig the political system and giving people who can vote a truly compelling reason to do so, unquote. Related to that is another point in our autopsy, and that is that the enduring point of community outreach is to build an ongoing relationship that aims for the party to become part of the fabric of everyday life. That means acknowledging the validity and power of people-driven movements, as well as recognizing and supporting authentic, progressive community leaders. It means focusing on how the party can best serve communities, not the other way around. Most of all, it means persisting with such engagement on an ongoing basis, not just at election time. And before we go to questions, I'd like to just talk a little bit more about the autopsy's recommendations in terms of party policies and programs, more outward-facing social change opportunities that we all have and that the party should be engaged in and seeking. The report says, quoting here, the party should avidly promote inspiring programs such as single-payer Medicare for all, free public college tuition, economic security, infrastructure and green jobs initiatives, and tackling the climate crisis. There's also the reality that engagement with people of color has been sorely lacking. It's reflected by the party's budget expenditures. As Karen mentioned, there have been recent revelations and critiques of how the Democratic Party has spent and not spent its money in the gubernatorial race in Virginia. Steve Phillips had a piece in The Nation just a few days ago spelling out just the paltry amount of money that the Democratic Party has spent in Virginia to reach out to its base, to people of color, to immigrants, to others who have a right to vote, who will vote if they have a good reason to vote. Instead, enormous amounts of money have been spent by the Democratic Party, as was the case last year, and notably again in Virginia, underscoring a lack of learning the lessons from last year, spent by the Democratic Party to chase those who are sometimes called, quote, the persuadables, unquote. But what we've learned is that the so-called persuadables are very rarely persuadable. And so it's a chase often for Republican votes, for the so-called Romney voters, who supposedly will be so repelled by Donald Trump that they're going to vote Democratic. You can see how well that panned out last year in the presidential race a year ago in November, and we're seeing that same mistake repeated in Virginia. So our autopsy report spells out not only what went wrong, but how this has to be changed in the future for, again, reaching the twin goals of defeating the right wing and building genuine progressive change capacities in this country. The reality as well is, and we go into this in the report, that it's not enough for the Democratic Party to stand for the rights of women in terms of reproductive rights, legal rights under the way that laws are enforced, although all of that, of course, is absolutely crucial and cannot be compromised upon. But as the report says, in the real world, the well-being of women is indivisible from their economic circumstances and security. To truly advance gender equality, the party needs to fight for the economic rights of all women. And just to sum up here, we talk in the report about the failure of the Democratic Party to listen to or reach out to rural voters, which was catastrophic in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And part of that is not aligning with farming families and others against big agriculture and corporate power that has been so decimating in so many rural communities. And also a parallel is that the party needs to be willing to move beyond tepid proposals like cap and trade to really take on big oil and the big energy conglomerates in terms of fighting against the extremely ominous, catastrophic climate change that's already upon us. So the last quote I want to give before I ask for questions is sort of a sum up from the autopsy report. What must now take place includes honest self-reflection and confronting a hard truth that many view the party, the Democratic Party, as often in service to a rapacious oligarchy and increasingly out of touch with people in its own base. The Democratic Party should disentangle itself ideologically and financially from Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, and other corporate interests that put profits ahead of public needs.